My knees hit the mud before I understood I was falling. Blood filled my mouth, but the pain in my chest wasn't from the wound on my side. It was a second pulse beating out of rhythm under my ribs like something alive was trying to claw its way out of me. Guildmates were shouting my name. Boots pounding closer through the tree line. Someone screaming for a healer who wasn't within a day's ride. All I could think was, I'm 3 days from the forest and my heart is stopping. 7 months earlier, none of this existed. I didn't have a second heartbeat. I didn't have a witch's name carved into my memory. I was just Kane Voss, a mid-rank adventurer from Aldermere, coughing blood into the dirt of a forest I wasn't supposed to survive. One contract away from losing everything I'd built. I remember the guild captain's face when they carried me in that first time. Torn open by a WRM's claw. My ribs cracked, my lung collapsing. He told my little sister Mira there was nothing left to do but wait for the end and to say her goodbyes while I could still hear her. I remember refusing to wait. I remember gripping her hand instead and telling her I wasn't finished yet. And I remember the woman who found me half dead at the edge of the hollow wood, kneeling over me with her hand pressed flat against my chest, whispering words I didn't understand, while something warm and wrong settled into my body and refused to leave, spreading through me like heat under ice. That woman's name was Alan. 7 months later, kneeling in the mud 3 days from her forest, I finally understood what she'd actually given me. And what she hadn't told me it would cost or how far she'd go to make sure I never found out too soon. Before the WRM, I was already running out of time in a different way. Guild contracts paid less every season, and Mira's tuition at the Healer Academy in Cross Hollow was due before the month's end. I took a bounty nobody else wanted. Clear a dusk-on WRM nesting near the hollow wood. A forest every guild in 3 provinces refused to enter for good reason. The Hollowwood had a reputation long before I set foot near it. Adventurers who wandered too deep didn't come back or came back wrong. Pale, hollow-eyed, muttering about a woman in the trees who watched them the whole way home and never quite left their thoughts again. The old guildmaster, Bregan, warned me twice not to take the contract, sliding the parchment back across his desk both times. I took it anyway. Mira's tuition mattered more to me than a ghost story whispered over ale. I tracked the WRM for 2 days along the forest's edge. Careful never to cross the tree line the locals marked with red string tied between the oldest trunks. On the 3rd day, patience ran out and the WRM found me first. This claw opened my side before I even drew my sword. I got one clean hit into its throat. Enough to make it retreat, screaming into the underbrush. Not enough to save myself. I dragged my body toward the tree line because it was the only shelter I could reach. Bleeding out with every step through wet leaves. I crossed the red string without meaning to. Too weak to notice the boundary until I was already past it. The moment I did, the forest went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Like something ancient had turned its attention toward the sound of my breathing. I don't remember much after that. Cold ground under my cheek, the taste of blood and dirt. A voice low and careful saying, "You shouldn't be here." Right before everything went dark and stayed dark, I woke up on a cot inside a cottage that smelled like crushed herbs and burnt sugar. My wounds stitched shut with thread that glowed faintly silver in the dim candlelight. My chest didn't hurt anymore. It should have hurt more than anything I'd ever survived. A woman sat by the window watching me with an expression I couldn't read yet. Somewhere between relief and hunger, like she'd been waiting a long time for someone exactly like me to walk through her door. "You died twice on my floor," she said. "I only let you come back once." Her name was Alan. She didn't explain who she was right away. Just changed my bandages, fed me broth spoonful by spoonful, and answered questions with half-answers that told me nothing and everything at once. On the 3rd day, I asked her directly why I wasn't dead. She set down the bowl she was holding and said the WRM's claw had torn straight through my real heart, clean through the muscle. There was nothing left to save, so she'd given me another one, something she'd made herself. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, until she took my hand and pressed it flat against my own chest underneath my ribs. Faint and steady, I felt it, a second pulse, slightly out of sync with the first. Like 2 drums played by different hands in different rooms. "It's not entirely mine anymore," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "But it isn't entirely yours either." I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't ask hard enough to find out. And I've regretted that since. She told me the heart was grown from forest magic and a piece of her own life force, fused together into something that could beat inside a human chest without killing him outright. It was the only thing that had stopped me from dying on her floor that first night. Then she told me the condition, laying it out like a simple fact instead of a warning. "It only works near the hollow wood," she said. "Travel too far and it stops. You'll feel it weaken first. Dizziness, cold hands, your pulse dragging behind itself. Ignore it and it fails completely. I asked how far was too far. She looked out the window for a long moment before answering, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table. Half a day's ride at most, maybe less depending on the road. I didn't know then that she was lying about the number. I didn't know the truth was closer to a week's hard travel before real danger began. She'd simply never tell me that. Not for a long time. Not until circumstances forced it out of her against her will. At the time, all I felt was gratitude. She'd saved my life with something that had cost her. I could see it in how tired she looked afterward. How her hands trembled when she thought I wasn't watching. How she ate almost nothing for 2 days straight. I thanked her more times than I could count. She waved off the thanks every time. But I noticed she never once suggested I leave. Not that day, not the next, not until I finally asked about my sister and the guild waiting on me back in Aldermere. Go, she finally said. 3 days later, handing me a folded map of safe distances she'd drawn herself in careful ink. Just don't go too far. I don't want to watch you die twice. Aldermere greeted me like a ghost walking through its own funeral. Bregan actually checked my pulse with his own fingers before he believed I was alive. Mira cried into my shoulder for a full minute before she hit me in the arm for scaring her half to death. The guild wanted a story. I gave them a short one. Found shelter, survived, made it back. I didn't mention the second heartbeat. I didn't mention Alan's name. Something about her felt like it wasn't mine to share yet. Not even with the people who loved me. Sarah noticed first. The way she noticed everything. She was the guild's best archer, and she'd been my closest friend since we were both green recruits sparring badly in the training yard behind the hall. She sat next to me at the tavern that night and asked quietly, "What actually happened out there, Kane?" The real version. I told her almost everything. The WRM, the forest, the woman who stitched me back together with something that wasn't quite medicine. Sarah listened without interrupting, turning her mug slowly on the table, then said, "That sounds less like a rescue and more like a bargain." I laughed it off. I didn't yet know how right she was. 2 weeks later, the first dizzy spell hit me during a routine escort job 4 hours outside Aldermere. My vision blurred, my hands went cold, and the second heartbeat under my ribs stuttered like a candle in wind. I barely made it back to town, still standing on my own 2 feet. Bregan wanted to send me to a healer. I told him I already knew what it was and that I had somewhere to be before it got worse. I rode for the Hollywood that same night alone, pushing my horse harder than I should have. And didn't stop until the second heartbeat steadied itself the moment I crossed the tree line. Elone was waiting at the cottage door before I even dismounted, arms folded, her expression unreadable in the dark. "You went too far," she said, not as a question. I asked how she knew I'd left Aldermere at all. She didn't answer that part. She just took my hand, checked my pulse against her own with practiced fingers, and told me I needed to rest there for the night before the heart would fully settle. I stayed. It felt easier than arguing, and some quiet part of me didn't mind staying at all. That first overnight visit became a pattern I didn't notice forming. A few days in the village, a dizzy spell, a ride back to the forest, a night in her cottage. And always her knowing exactly when I'd crossed the line before I ever told her a word. The second time it happened, I hadn't even felt dizzy yet. I was 3 hours out drinking with Sarah and 2 other guild members when a black-feathered crow landed on the windowsill and stared directly at me through the glass for almost a full minute before flying off into the dark. Sarah joked that it looked like it was spying on me. I laughed along, but something about the bird's stillness, the way it hadn't blinked once, didn't sit right with me. That night, the second heartbeat stuttered exactly on schedule, right as I stepped outside to head home alone. On my next forest visit, I mentioned the crow to Elone, half as a joke, watching her reaction closely. She went very still for a moment before saying, "Crows were common in the Hollowwood, and it meant nothing at all." I let it go. I wanted to let it go more than I wanted the truth. A month later, she repeated a joke back to me. One I'd made at the tavern, word for word, about Bregan's terrible cooking. A joke I was certain I'd never told her myself, not once in any of our conversations. When I asked how she knew it, she said I must have mentioned it during a previous visit. I hadn't. I remembered every conversation we'd had because there weren't that many yet, and none of them had touched on Bregan's stew. I started paying closer attention after that. I noticed the crows more perched on fence posts along roads I'd never told her I was taking. I noticed how the water in her wash basin sometimes rippled on its own, even with the windows shut and no wind moving through the room. I noticed that whenever I came back from Aldermere upset about something, a bad contract, an argument with Bregan, she already seemed to know before I finished the first sentence, sometimes before I'd even sat down. I asked her outright one evening if she was watching me somehow, even from the forest. She laughed it off, calling the idea absurd, and changed the subject to how my color looked better that day than the last visit. Brushing a hand against my cheek, I didn't push harder. Some coward part of me didn't want to know the answer yet. Didn't want to lose the one place that felt safe. Looking back, that was my first real mistake. Not the not knowing, but the choosing not to ask again and again until the silence became its own kind of agreement. I told myself the heart bond probably let some feelings pass between us, some faint magical echo, and that was explanation enough. It wasn't, but it let me keep visiting her without dread. And at the time, that mattered more to me than the truth would have. I didn't yet know how far her watching actually went, or how long she'd already been doing it before I ever crossed that red string in the first place, WRM claw or not. Around the same time, Sarah started asking to come with me on my Hollywood trips. She said it as a joke at first. Someone should meet the woman who keeps saving your life. But she asked more than once. Seriously, and I kept finding reasons to say no. I told myself I was protecting Elone's privacy. Really, some instinct told me the two of them meeting would go badly. Though I couldn't have said why yet, only that the thought made my stomach tighten. Mira noticed the pattern in my visits, too, and asked over dinner if I was courting someone I hadn't told her about. I said it was complicated. She said that always meant yes and made me promise to bring her along someday. A letter came from Mira's academy that month, warning that another term's tuition would be due within 6 weeks, sooner than expected. I picked up 2 extra contracts to cover it, both requiring travel farther than my usual range from Aldermere. When I told Elone about the contracts during my next visit, her face changed in a way I hadn't seen before. Not worry exactly, something sharper underneath the concern, like a decision already forming behind her eyes. Take the closer one, she said, setting my tea down harder than necessary. The other route runs 2 days past where I'd feel safe letting you go. I pushed back for the first time. Mira needed the money and the farther contract paid nearly double what the closer one offered. Elone's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue further that night. She just asked me to be careful in a tone that didn't sound like concern so much as a warning aimed at someone else entirely. I took the farther contract anyway. 3 days out from Aldermere, escorting a merchant caravan through bandit territory along the eastern trade road. Sarah came along as backup archer, same as she always did on jobs like this. The job went smoothly for the first 2 days. On the third, deep in bandit country, my second heartbeat started stuttering harder and earlier than any previous trip. Faster and worse than the distance alone should have caused. I collapsed mid-watch that night without warning. Sarah found me on the ground, pulse thready, skin freezing despite the campfire burning right beside me. She got me back to the caravan camp and forced a fever tonic down my throat, though she admitted afterward it didn't look like any fever she'd ever treated in the field. Your heartbeat felt wrong, she told me later quietly. Like there were 2 rhythms fighting each other under your ribs instead of one. We finished the contract 2 days late. Both of us shaken. Sarah more openly worried than I had ever seen her before. She asked again, more seriously, this time to meet the woman keeping me alive. No more excuses. I finally agreed, mostly out of guilt for how close the trip had come to killing me in front of her. I sent word ahead that I was bringing a friend to the Hollowwood. Elone's reply came back fast, delivered by the same black crow I'd noticed months before. A single line written in her careful hand. Come alone. I ignored the note and brought Sarah anyway. I wanted her to see for herself that Elone wasn't dangerous. I still believe that completely, even after everything. Elone met us at the Treeline, polite and composed, offering Sarah tea and a tour of the cottage like the note had never existed. Sarah thanked her, professional as ever. But I caught her studying every shelf, every jar, every locked cabinet in the room without seeming to look at any of it directly. The visit ended without incident. No argument, no scene. On the ride home, Sarah said only one thing. She watched you more than she watched me, even when I was the one talking. 2 weeks later, Sarah's bowstring snapped mid-draw during a routine hunt, nearly taking off 2 of her fingers. She'd rest-wrung that bow herself the night before, and swore the string had been new and sound when she checked it. I didn't connect it to anything at first. Bowstring snapped, sometimes even good ones. I told myself that even as some cold part of me didn't fully believe it. The week after that, a contract Sarah and I had both signed up for, a well-paying escort job 3 days from Aldermere, vanished from the guild board overnight. Reassigned to another team without either of our names ever appearing on the paperwork again. Bregan swore he hadn't touched the listing. The guild clerk swore the same, checking the ledger twice in front of us. Nobody could explain how our names had been removed so cleanly. I started keeping quieter about my travel plans after that, telling fewer people where I was headed and when, even Bregan. It didn't feel like paranoia yet. It felt like caution I couldn't fully justify. On my next forest visit, Elone seemed unusually pleased that I'd be staying closer to Aldermere for a while. "It's safer this way," she said, refilling my tea before I'd finished it. Not quite meeting my eyes. "For both of us?" I asked, half joking, if she'd had anything to do with the missing contract. She looked at me for a long moment before laughing it off as a ridiculous question. And the conversation moved on before I could press it any further. I noticed, though, that she never actually said no. A third strange incident happened not long after. A poison mushroom found its way into a stew Sarah cooked for the two of us one evening. The kind that caused violent illness, but never death by design. We both got sick. I recovered by morning. Sarah didn't fully recover for 3 days. The healer who treated her said the mushroom wasn't native to any market or field near Aldermere. It grew, as far as anyone could identify, almost exclusively in deep old-growth forest soil, the kind found nowhere within a day's ride of town. I told myself plenty of forests could grow that mushroom. I told myself a lot of things that spring. None of them very convincing even to me. Sarah stopped joking about meeting Elone again after that. She started asking me quietly and seriously to be careful around her instead, watching my face when she said it. I still wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. Not until I found something I couldn't explain away with excuses of my own making. No matter how hard I tried, it happened on an ordinary visit. Nothing planned, nothing suspicious to start. Elone had gone to gather herbs near the stream, leaving me alone in the cottage longer than usual, maybe an hour. I wasn't looking for anything. I was looking for a cup. Reaching into a cabinet I'd never opened before, when my hand knocked loose a false panel at the back, and a small wooden box fell out onto the floor with a hollow thud. Inside was a cloth pouch of dried mushroom caps that matched the ones from Sarah's poison stew almost exactly, alongside a coil of bowstring identical in weight and color to the one that had snapped in Sarah's hands weeks earlier. My stomach dropped before my mind fully caught up with what I was looking at, my hands already going cold around the edges of the box. Underneath the pouch and the string was a folded water-stained letter, one of Mira's addressed to me that I'd never received. The guild stamp on the back showed it had been delivered to Aldermere weeks ago, long before I'd ever noticed it missing. I opened it with shaking hands. Mira had written asking why I hadn't answered her last 3 letters. Worried something had happened to me, asking directly if the woman in the forest was the reason I'd gone quiet on her. There were 2 more letters underneath it. Both from Mira, both unopened, both somehow ending up hidden in a witch's cottage 2 days from where they were supposed to be delivered in the first place. At the very bottom of the box was a leather-bound journal, older than anything else inside. Its cover worn soft from years of handling, the spine cracked from being opened again and again. I opened it against every instinct telling me to put the box back and pretend I'd seen nothing, that some doors were better left shut. The handwriting inside was Elone's, dated years back, describing a man named Ashen, an adventurer she'd saved the same way she'd saved me, given a heart the same way, kept close the same way in the very cottage I was standing in now. The entries about Ashen grew shorter and colder over time. The dates further apart, the tone flatter. The final one read only. He tried to leave anyway. I couldn't let the heart go with him. There was no explanation of what couldn't let it go meant. There didn't need to be. The blank pages after it. Dozens of them said enough on their own. I heard the cottage door open behind me before I could close the journal or the box, my heart hammering both its rhythms at once. Elone stood in the doorway with a bundle of herbs in her arms, watching me hold the evidence of everything she'd hidden, her expression shifting from surprise to something far more controlled in the space of a single breath. "Put it back," she said quietly. Not a plea, an instruction delivered flat and even. I asked her, voice shaking, who Ashen was and what had happened to him. She set the herbs down slowly on the counter, like she was buying herself time to decide how much of the truth I'd actually earned. "He's not important anymore," she said, stepping closer. "You are." That answer told me everything the journal hadn't. I demanded real answers, and for the first time since I'd met her, Elone stopped softening her words for my sake, dropping the gentle tone entirely. She admitted the mushrooms were hers. She admitted the bowstring. She admitted flatly without a flicker of shame that she'd wanted Sarah gone from my life before Sarah got close enough to matter. "She was going to take you somewhere I couldn't follow." Elone said like that alone justified everything sitting in the box between us. I asked about the missing contract, the one that had vanished from the guild board without a trace. She said she'd paid a crier to intercept the listing before it ever reached the wall. Simple as arranging flowers. I asked about Mira's letters. Her answer came slower this time, quieter, almost embarrassed for the first time in the conversation. I didn't want her pulling you back toward a life that doesn't include me in it. I asked finally about Ashen, the man in the journal, the one who tried to leave and never made it back into these pages again. Ilone's composure cracked for the first time since I'd known her hands curling into fists at her sides. She told me Ashen had tried to travel 3 weeks past the safe range despite every warning she'd given him. Convinced the limitation was exaggerated. It wasn't exaggerated for him, she said, voice barely above a whisper. The heart failed completely. I couldn't save him a second time, no matter how fast I rode. I believed her in that moment because I wanted to believe there was a line even she wouldn't cross on purpose. Some limit to what she'd allow herself to do. I didn't yet know how much of that story was true and how much was another careful half-truth shaped exactly to keep me from testing my own limits against hers. I told her I needed space to think and turned to leave the cottage that same night. Despite the late hour and the distance back to Aldermere waiting ahead of me, she stepped in front of the door before I reached it, blocking it fully with her body. You're upset, she said. That's not a safe state to travel in. Not tonight. I told her to move. She didn't. Not an inch. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't warmth or worry. A flat cold calculation like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever I was about to try next. I've kept you alive, she said, voice low and even each word deliberate. I've kept everyone who ever tried to take you away from succeeding. I'm not going to stop just because you found a box. She let me leave that night eventually. But not before making it clear without ever once raising her voice that she'd noticed every plan I hadn't spoken aloud yet, and probably several I hadn't thought of. I rode back to Aldermere with the second heartbeat pounding wrong in my chest the entire way. Unsure if it was the distance or my own fear making it stutter harder than usual. I didn't tell Sarah everything that night. I only told her enough to make her lock her door and watch her back for a while without naming the reason. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to build a normal life out of range of the forest. Taking short contracts, sleeping at the Guildhall, avoiding the Hollywood entirely, testing how long I could stay away. The heart punished me for it slowly and then all at once. Dizziness came daily instead of only after long trips. My hands stayed cold, even sitting by the fire. I was testing her claimed limits and losing badly. Bregan noticed my condition worsening and pulled me from active contracts. Worried I was relapsing from the original WRM wound months earlier, I let him believe that instead of telling him the truth. Sarah stayed close during those weeks, sharper and more careful than before. Watching the tree lean every time we left Aldermere together like she expected something to come out of it eventually. On the 15th night, it did. I woke in the guild infirmary to Bregan's voice telling someone I was stable but weak. That whatever illness I'd caught had nearly stopped my heart entirely in my sleep. No warning at all. I tried to sit up and found I couldn't lift my own arm. My vision swam at the edges. The last thing I remember before the dark took me fully was a familiar scent of crushed herbs. Far too close for a village infirmary 2 streets from the Guildhall. When I woke again, I wasn't in Aldermere anymore, and the light through the window was wrong for the season. I was back in Ilone's cottage. The second heartbeat, steady and calm under my ribs for the first time in weeks. My body wrapped in blankets that weren't mine and never had been. She told me I'd collapsed in the Guildhall, and she'd been sent for immediately. I asked who had sent for her. She didn't answer directly, busying her hands with the fire instead. 3 days passed before I was strong enough to ask what Aldermere believed had happened to me. Ilone's answer came out carefully rehearsed like she'd practiced it. They think you didn't survive it, she said. I let them think that. It was easier than explaining the truth to people who wouldn't understand it anyway. I asked what that meant for Mira, for Sarah, for Bregan who'd carried me in twice now. She said she'd make sure they were provided for from a distance without ever needing to see me suffer through another relapse in a place she couldn't reach in time. I understood then that she hadn't saved me from a relapse at all. She'd manufactured one or let one happen without warning me how bad it could get, so that a fake death would feel merciful instead of the monstrous thing it actually was. I accused her of it outright, my voice cracking on the words. She didn't deny it, didn't even flinch. You were dying out there anyway, she said, calm as ever. At least here, you're not dying alone in some infirmary bed. I demanded to be let go, to correct the lie before it spread any further through the people who loved me and were grieving me right now. Ilone's expression didn't crack this time. It hardened into something I hadn't seen before. You can walk out that door right now if you want, she said. But the heart only just steadied. Walk far enough today and this time I might not get to you before it stops for good. And neither of us wants that. I didn't know if that threat was true or another exaggeration built to keep me still. I didn't know if I could survive testing it just to find out for certain. For the first time since the WRM's claw had opened my side. I understood exactly how trapped I actually was. Not by distance, not by magic alone, but by a woman who'd learned exactly which truths would keep me still and which lies would work just as well. I stopped arguing that night, not because I'd given up, but because I needed her to believe I had completely and convincingly. I spent the following days playing calm, letting Elone believe the fight had gone out of me entirely, while quietly studying every book on her shelves whenever she left the cottage for herbs or water. Most of it was useless herb lore, or weather charms. Nothing about heart magic specifically, or the ritual that had bound us together in the first place. She kept the real knowledge somewhere I hadn't found yet or hadn't been allowed to find. On the fourth day, she mentioned an old hedge which living 2 valleys over. Someone she called harmless but nosy, a woman named Marin who'd once tried to warn Elone away from working heart magic at all, years before I existed to her. It was the first real lead I had in weeks. I filed the name away carefully and said nothing about it out loud. Getting away from the cottage without raising loud suspicion took another week of careful patience. Small requests to walk alone for air. Short trips to the stream that I stretched a little longer each time, minute by minute. On the 9th day, I finally pushed one of those walks far enough to reach the valley path Elone had mentioned once. Moving as fast as my unsteady legs allowed without drawing attention. Old Marin's home was a leaning stone cottage buried in ivy, and she opened the door before I even knocked like she'd been expecting someone eventually to come stumbling up her path. "You're the one with her heartbeat in your chest," she said. "I can hear it from here, uneven as it is." I told her everything. The false limitation, the fake death, the box of evidence. The man named Ashen, who never made it past a journal entry. Marin listened without interrupting, her face growing grimmer with every detail I gave her. When I finished, she told me something Elone had never once mentioned in 7 months. Heart bond magic like this wasn't meant to be one-sided at all. It was meant to be split evenly between 2 people. A shared heart is supposed to divide the burden between 2 people through a binding ritual, not rest entirely on one chest. Marin said, "One person carrying the whole weight alone is a corruption of the original spell. Not the natural shape of it at all." She said Elone would have known this from the start. Heart magic like this had been taught to every witch of her line for generations. The ritual passed down specifically to prevent exactly the kind of one-sided dependency I was trapped in right now. I asked why Elone would hide something that could have made both our lives easier from the very beginning, from the first night in that cottage. Marin's answer was blunt. No softening at all. Because splitting it evenly means she stops being the only reason you survive. And from what you're describing, being needed like that is the only kind of love she trusts anymore. She gave me the ritual written on a single folded page in old careful script, warning me it required both parties present and willing. I couldn't perform it alone no matter how badly I wanted to skip that part. I asked if there was any way to break the bond entirely instead to be free of Elone and the heart both. No strings left at all. Marin said it was possible, but it would kill me the same way it had likely killed Ashen. The heart wasn't separate from me anymore. It was mine now, too. Whether I liked it or not. That left one real choice. Convince Elone to perform the split willingly, or find a way to force her hand before she found out what I knew. I walked back to the cottage with the ritual page hidden inside my boot, rehearsing exactly how I'd bring it up without triggering the kind of reaction that had put me in this position in the first place. Elone noticed I'd been gone longer than usual the moment I walked through the door, her eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't ask where. She just studied my face like she was searching for a lie forming behind my eyes. I told her I wanted to talk calmly about what happened next between us, not as a demand, but as a conversation. The first real one we'd had since the box fell out of that cabinet. She agreed cautiously, arms crossed. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was steering something instead of being steered by her instincts. I laid the ritual page on the table between us and told her exactly what Marin had explained, that the bond was never meant to be carried by one person alone. Not by design, not ever. Elone went pale, looking at the page like she recognized the handwriting on it even folded shut before she'd read a single word of it. "You went to her," she said quietly, not angry. Something closer to afraid, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. I asked her directly why she'd never once mentioned that splitting the burden was possible. Not in 7 months, not once. She was silent long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual careful control left in it. "Because the day it split evenly, you won't need me to survive anymore. You'll just be someone who visits when it's convenient." I told her that wasn't a reason to lie to me for 7 months straight. She said it felt like a good enough reason every single day she'd done it and every night after. She told me the rest then, unprompted, like the truth had been waiting behind a door she finally let swing open on its own. Her own family's forest had been burned by villagers generations ago who feared what heart witches like her could do. Torches thrown into the same tree line I'd once crossed bleeding. And the last man she'd loved before Ashen had left her the moment he learned what she was. Calling her a monster to her face before he walked out for good and never once looked back. Every time someone I love finds out the truth they leave, she said, not looking at me. So I stopped telling the truth. I found ways to make leaving impossible, instead one small lie at a time. I understood in that moment exactly why she led her whole life around never letting distance happen. But understanding. It didn't mean I was willing to keep living inside her fear instead of choosing my own life for once. I told her I wanted the ritual. Not someday. Now, tonight, before either of us lost the nerve to go through with it. She hadn't agreed yet when the cottage door slammed open behind us without warning. 3 armed figures stood in the doorway, wearing the gray sashes of the Church Inquisition, blades already drawn and gleaming in the firelight. Mud still fresh on their boots from the forest path. Their leader, a hard-eyed woman named Inquisitor Dala, said they'd been tracking reports of heart magic corruption in the Hollow Wood for months, following whispers from villages on the far side of the valley. And tonight, they intended to end it for good. Elone's hand sparked with defensive magic instantly, placing herself between me and the blades without a second of hesitation. Without even glancing back at me first. I grabbed her wrist before she could throw the first spell, holding it firm. Killing them solves nothing, I said. There's a whole Inquisition behind them who will just send more once these 3 don't come back. Dala demanded I step aside from the witch so they could finish their work cleanly and be gone by morning. I told her the witch had a name and that whatever corruption they thought they were hunting wasn't the thing standing in front of them. I held up the ritual page, explaining as fast as I could that the bond wasn't a curse feeding on me. It was a shared burden about to be balanced properly. Evidence I offered as proof this wasn't the one-sided predation the Inquisition had been sent here to stop. Dala wasn't convinced by words alone, her blade still steady in her hand. She said she'd only stand down if she witnessed the ritual herself. Right now to confirm it was balance and not control dressed up as one. Elone looked at me for a long moment, the fight still trembling in her hands before finally lowering them and stepping back from the doorway. Do it, she said. Show them. Show yourself once and for all. We performed the ritual with the Inquisitor's blades still drawn behind us. Marin's instructions guiding our joined hands over a bowl of blessed water and forest ash. Both our voices reciting the binding words together instead of one alone carrying the weight. The second heartbeat in my chest shifted the moment the final word left our mouths. Steadier, lighter, no longer entirely borrowed, no longer entirely hers to control alone from a distance. Elone gasped and pressed a hand to her own chest. Feeling for the first time in years a piece of the burden finally leave her to rest somewhere shared instead of carried solitary night after night. Dala watched the light fade between us, lowered her blade slowly. And said only that she'd report the bond as balanced, not corrupted for now. And only for as long as it stayed that way. The Inquisitors left before dawn, though Dala warned on her way out that she'd be watching for any sign the balance tipped back toward one-sided again. In the silence after they'd gone, Elone sat at the table with her hands still shaking, staring at the ritual page like she couldn't quite believe what we'd just done together. Willingly, I asked her to test it with me, to try a short distance apart, just to the edge of the property. To see if the new balance actually held under real pressure. She hesitated longer than I expected before finally agreeing. Setting down the page. I walked to the tree line and stopped, waiting for the familiar stutter that never came. My second heartbeat stayed steady, calm, unchanged the whole way. Behind me, through the window, I saw her hand pressed to her own chest. Feeling the same steadiness on her end for the first time and longer than she'd admit. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. We didn't need to say it out loud. Over the following weeks, I traveled back to Aldermere to undo the lie of my death. Starting with Bregan, who nearly hit me before he hugged me instead. Curious and relieved in the same breath, cursing my name the whole time. Mira cried harder than she had after the WRM attack and made me promise twice that I'd never let anyone fake my death to her again. No matter the reason given. Sarah took the news quietest of everyone in the room. She listened to the full story, the box, the letters, the ritual without interrupting once. Then said only, "I'm glad you're the one who found the way out of it yourself." I asked her if she could forgive Elone for the mushrooms, the bowstring, the missing contract, all of it. Sarah said forgiveness wasn't hers to give. But she wasn't going to spend her life avoiding a forest just because of what one desperate woman had done in it once. Elone and Sarah never became close. Not really, not after everything. But the next time they stood in the same room. Elone offered an apology instead of a smile. Stiff and awkward but real. And Sarah accepted it the same careful way. I took contracts again after that. Farther ones, the kind that used to trigger the old limitation within hours of leaving. The new bond held every time, steady no matter the distance. Exactly the way Marin's ritual had promised it would from the start. Elone still watched the tree line whenever I left. I noticed, standing at the same window each time. Old habits didn't vanish just because the magic behind them had finally changed for good. But she stopped hiding the letters. She stopped touching Sarah's equipment. She stopped rewriting the story of my life behind my back. Because for the first time, she didn't need to control the distance just to survive it. I could have stayed in Aldermere permanently, free of the forest entirely now that the balance was even between us. I thought about it seriously for a while, turning it over more nights than I expected to. Instead, I bought a small plot of land at the edge of the hollow wood. Close enough to reach Elone's cottage on foot in under an hour, far enough that it was clearly still my own home and not an extension of hers. I built it with my own hands over the following month. Half out of stubbornness. Half because some part of me wanted her to watch me choose to stay close instead of being forced into it by a lie. Elone helped with the roof, awkwardly passing up nails and boards. The way someone helps who's never had a reason to build anything meant to last before. Now Mira visits on holidays now, always bringing something from the academy. Sarah still stops by when contracts bring her through the region. And Elone has learned slowly to sit in the same room as her without her hands sparking under the table anymore. My second heartbeat still beats a little different from my first. A rhythm that isn't entirely mine and never fully hers either. Steady no matter how far I travel now.